Good morning, everyone. Firstly, I want to start by thanking the survivors of domestic and family violence for their submissions in a call for change, 409 of them. I want to thank the Queensland Police Service, the current and former members, 365 of them who made submissions, thousands of them who filled out a workforce cultural survey. Thank you. To the community organisations, the 50 of them that put in detailed submissions to help drive the change that is needed, to all of you, over 800 submissions in fact, we thank you for your efforts. Sadly, a call for change is the latest report in a government that has shelves of them that they have never implemented to keep women and children safe. I have a list of 18 of them, and this is them beside me. Thousands of pages, hundreds of recommendations, and proof of a system that continues to fail the vulnerable in our community. It started with Not Now, Not Ever in 2015 when the government was first elected. Then the response to the report of the Special Task Force on Domestic and Family Violence later that year. The QPS, Domestic and Family Violence Prevention Strategy, in 2016. The Domestic and Family Violence Death Review and Advisory Board annual report in 2017, a further annual report in 2018-19, and then in 2019 the QPS Strategic Review. Then in 2020, the Death Review and Advisory Board annual report, followed by another one in 2021. The same year that the Coroner's Court handed down their findings into the death of Tara Brown. The same year that the next Domestic and Family Violence Strategy was released, and then the Women's Safety and Justice Task Force Report 1, Hear Her Voice. In 2022, the next annual report of the Domestic and Family Violence Death Review. In 2022, the second report into Hear Her Voice. The same year that the coroner found the findings in the death of Hannah Clark. Later that year, the coroner's finding into Doreen Langham. And finally, the one that we spoke about several weeks ago, the Queensland Audit Office, keeping people safe from domestic and family violence, and the picture it painted of a government that fails to plan, deliver and evaluate. And today's report with over 400 pages. The Premier says a line has been drawn in the sand here. Why wasn't the line drawn in the sand here, or here, or here? And how many of these victims would not have been had that line been drawn in the sand? It's clear from the mountain of reports that the government fails to plan, deliver and evaluate. And there are consequences when a government views everything through the prism of an announcement and not having the detailed follow-through. Not Now, Not Ever was a roadmap for change to keep women and children safe. A call for change is a proof that the government has lost its way following that roadmap. The government has learned nothing from the Goldrake Review. And if you want proof of that, there are 3 examples we are seeing in just the space of the last few days. The fact that yesterday the government stood up at exactly the same time they released the report, I would argue hasn't given you the opportunity to prosecute what is in it, and I look forward to the Premier standing up again now that we've been able to absorb the recommendations. We had a minister release a youth justice report that she had held for 8 months on the day that some damning findings happened on youth justice. And then for the findings into Mackay to escalate today to the board being held accountable when the minister has had that for 2 months tells you everything you need to know about the government's resistance to letting the sun shine in. The government has given up on integrity It's given up on ministerial accountability, and they are more focused on their political survival than the survival of innocent women and children. And there are proof points throughout here that the government could have acted on, and they didn't. I'll ask Amanda to say some words.
Thanks, David. The only people who have felt the consequences of the failings of this government are the women and children who have lost their lives at the hand of domestic and family violence, those that still live in fear every single day, and those that have not had their voice heard. Those individuals, those women and children like Mary Benedito, like Hannah Clark and her 3 children, like Tara Brown, like Doreen Langham, like Vanessa Godfrey, like Tanya Trickey, and the list goes on and on and on. The Attorney-General, the former Child Safety Minister, one of the worst child safety ministers in this state's history, oversees now the transformation of what should be a system that protects women and children. When we saw the revelations and the recommendations that came out of Hear Her Voice and the Women's Safety Justice Task Force, the response from the Attorney was, "We hear you." Unfortunately, this report has not been listened to, with recommendation number 88 implementing a supervision overseer of the change. We are still sitting 1 year on with an interim position and no full-time position allocated. If this was the wake-up call from Not Now, Not Ever, if this was the wake-up call the Palaszczuk government certainly wasn't listening, if this was the wake-up call from Hear Her Voice, then for those women and children who don't have a voice anymore, I don't know what this government will listen to. But what I will correct the record on is the comments made by Minister Ryan this morning in the media, that this government called for the Commission into inquiry. I will not allow a minister of this government take away the voices of women, brave victims that came forward, or those volunteers of the Women and Safety Justice Task Force that gave up their time listening to the trauma and the evidence from those brave victims. It was recommendation 2 of Hear Her Voice, of the Women's Safety Justice Task Force, that called for this inquiry to hold this government to account. We have a Premier that is out of touch. We have an Attorney-General that pays lip service. We have a Health Minister that oversees obstetric violence that has left hundreds of women in my local community unable to give birth to children. And we have a Police Minister that wants to take accolades and accountability from victims that don't have a voice. On behalf of those victims from Queensland, we hear you, we will ensure there is accountability, and we will continue to take up the fight to ensure that women and children are protected across this great state.
Thanks, Amanda. Over to you, and thank you.
The Premier is backing the Police Commissioner. Do you think she should keep her job?
The Commissioner needs the clear air and the focus to be able to implement the recommendations that are here. So the answer is yes. I will make another point, having listened yesterday to the Premier talk about time in office and the opportunity to embed the reforms along the journey. The Police Commissioner wasn't in her role nearly 6 years ago, but the Police Minister was, and the Commissioner wasn't in her role nearly 8 years ago, but the Premier was. So if we're talking about responsibility, I'd like to ask what level of responsibility rests with the ministers, with the Premier, with the government, with the culture of cover-ups, with all of those missed opportunities. So I do believe the Police Commissioner deserves the opportunity to drive those reforms. What I like about the recommendations is that they hold timelines that enable people to be held accountable, timelines to the month. It shouldn't just be the Commissioner. Ministers also need to be tasked with which recommendations relate to them, and they also need to be held accountable. So if it is a line in the sand, which should have been crossed anywhere along this journey, well then every person responsible for fixing this needs to be held accountable. And the fact that it's been the same faces in the same roles that have overseen all of this tells you everything you need to know about a lack of ministerial accountability and integrity in this state.
The report details failures of leadership. Do you think anyone in the leadership team in the QPS should be held to account following this report?
Well, someone has to be held responsible, and there's no question about that. I'd argue in Westminster there is ministerial accountability as well. Being the police minister isn't just a ceremonial position. Being the premier isn't just about turning up to events. You've got to plan, deliver and evaluate. And the one consistency through all of these has been the same premier. And I'd argue it's been the same faces in different roles. The current Attorney-General, who will be responsible for some of these recommendations, was in fact the Minister for Domestic and Family Violence during all of these. The Police Minister has been in his role for almost the entirety of this government.
But what about police officers? If the report was heavily critical of the leadership and failures there, what about police officers?
And they must be held accountable for the delivery of these reforms. And the Commissioner needs the clear air to be able to do that, and she needs the 100% focus.
Why does she deserve that clear air?
Because right now women and children's lives depend on it. And there is nothing more important than for these reforms to be embedded and for people to be held accountable. And that starts from the top down. And there's some clear timelines on this, which is why I found the recommendations so powerful. And the Commissioner needs a clear air to be able to do that. But she must be held accountable. And so too must the senior figures in the Palaszczuk government, who've been the one consistency through all of these myriads of failed reports.
The timeline of the deadline for these reforms just prior to the next election, that will put some pressure on the government?
Many of these recommendations we will be able to hold the government accountable on behalf of the women and children and families of this state. And I'm not going to accept 1 ounce of wriggle room in the future for the Premier and her ministers to either accept blowouts in timelines or to point the finger at someone else. There are failings that have been exposed, and people must be held accountable, and that involves people throughout the process, absolutely. But we cannot accept that months down the track, if reforms aren't embedded, we cannot have a situation where it's not someone's responsibility who is a Minister of the Crown. That has been the common theme from this government. No one is ever accountable for anything. That there is a health crisis, and Amanda's just outlined what's happened in her community. So today, the Minister chose today, of all days, to somehow try to focus the blame on the board of a report she's held for 2 years. A minister who's overseen the complete and utter deterioration of a health system long before COVID, and yet she's not responsible. A roads minister who's overseen the biggest blowouts in the history of this state. A Deputy Premier who decided to sign up for a deal worth $220 million to make a political point of an asset we never own. A Treasurer who decided to embark on a rental tax in the middle of a housing crisis. A Housing Minister who has not delivered even a fraction of the social houses that she said she would. And yet no one is ever held accountable. No one.
Police officers should be losing their jobs over this damning report.
I reflected on what the Commissioner said yesterday, and there is no doubt that there will be accountability for people who have done and said things that this report has exposed, and anything short of that would be unsatisfactory for every Queenslander, particularly the more than 400 brave women who came forward and made a submission. So that's a given, and no Queenslander would accept that's not the case. But likewise, no Queenslander will accept that after 18 false starts, that it is now going to be someone else's fault. The buck stops with this government, and they have been there for nearly 8 years. And they have presided over a litany of failures across all levels of service delivery. And the first time I stood in front of you, I spoke about service delivery was going to be one of the key things I spoke about. And I spoke of health and law and order and housing and education, and the failures continue to mount. Well, this is the failures just on domestic and family violence.
Do you think, though, isn't it a good idea to have inquiries, though, to look at what's going on? I mean, are you saying the inquiry shouldn't happen?
Of course it's a good idea. And as the Auditor-General says, you plan, deliver and then evaluate. The government announces and then runs away to the next crisis. There is never anyone prepared to do what they are paid to do, and that is plan, deliver and evaluate. It's not enough to have a shocking report and then walk away and come back subsequently and have another shocking report. The way that good governments work is you reflect on it, you outline a strategy, and then you go back and review how it's going. In the Auditor-General's report, it showed that there were KPIs that the government hadn't looked at since 2015. It showed a culture of that the government doesn't even know domestic and family violence perpetrators, where they are in jail, when they're released, and what programs are done before, during and after. There are some damning findings throughout all of these. And my point is, while governments are more focused on media management than dealing with issues, they will never get on top of service delivery. And this government is one of the worst that the nation has seen when it comes to actually delivering services and planning and evaluating the delivery of them.
The Commissioner said that the training that was meant to happen, where officers were going to be better equipped to deal with domestic violence complaints, was delayed due to COVID. Is that a cop-out?
Well, one of the recommendations, which I was interested in getting more information, is recommendation 17, and it points to the fact that in some cases existing staff will be given up to 24 months to be able to do training in domestic and family violence. And I would suggest that there are many key roles that it should not take that long. And if failings have happened historically, it shouldn't continue to occur. And these timelines should be used as an outer limit, not as a target. We can do a lot better than some of these targets, and that's one of those areas.
Do you think COVID's being blamed for inaction?
Well, the government's blamed COVID for many things, and I don't doubt for one moment that police are weary and fatigued by some of the duties that they had to undertake. But police officers were telling us that they were fatigued long before COVID. And it's important, as part of analysing this report, that we do two things. One is we drive cultural change by making sure that those bad apples are weeded out and that the culture is embedded all the way through the organisation. The second is that we have an unequivocal stance that we are proud of the Queensland Police Service and we are proud of the role that frontline staff play and that people who wear blue uniforms play. And Queenslanders need to know that the role of police is a vital one, and that we respect what they do. We respect the fact that every day they leave home and they put themselves at risk to keep us safe. And cultural change must happen, and those who have perpetrated the bad culture that has permeated through the organisation should be held accountable. The vast majority of police officers need to know that we respect what they do every day.
Do you support you support all the recommendations from the Commission of Inquiry?
Thanks for the question, Jack. I've asked Amanda to prepare a briefing for Shadow Cabinet, which we will do, and we'll look at that and make sure that we have detailed, considered responses. The first time I saw the report was driving back from Toowoomba yesterday, so you can forgive me for not giving a categoric answer, but I've probably picked up half a dozen things that I'd like more information on. One of them is recommendation 3, and that talks about allocation of funding within 18 months. Well, I would argue if the resources are indicated in 12 months, which is recommendation 2, I would suggest the government could look at bringing that funding forward as part of my EFA. So that's one question. I mentioned recommendation 17 before. Both recommendation 29 and 63 relate to the delivery of either safe spaces in police stations or upgrading lighting. I want to know that people are going to be held accountable, and there's no wriggle room to those, and there's not a lot of clarity on that. Recommendation 38 speaks about when officers are exposed to trauma and allowing them to go to less stressful environments. Well, I want to know what happens to the backfilling of that. If those people are in frontline roles, keeping the community safe, what is the strategy around the workforce to make sure that the community can stay safe? And recommendation 61, which is around police liaison officers and the access to Q Prime and Q Light. What processes are being put in place to make sure that what is very, very important information is protected, and that's this report has shown the dangers of that information not being protected. So we want to know what role what training will be put in place there. Yep. Yes, we do, and it's clear that that'll be an important building block in making sure that accountability is there throughout, and having that separation is something that we welcome.
Can I ask one inquiry again to the board? Do you welcome the board being sacked, given the investigation found that there was a toxic culture in the hospital?
The Minister has had for 2 months this on her agenda, and she chose yesterday. It was calculated, it was underhanded, and it was arrogant. So to try and make the board the scapegoat for the failings of Queensland Health that has been led by this minister is a little bit rich, and to do it on that day. Queensland Health and the 28 town halls that we have run have exposed that frontline staff have never felt less empowered. The HHSs have never had less responsibility, and the funding which we have articulated shows that the money to the front line has not been forthcoming despite budgets increasing. So for the minister to somehow suggest that it's always someone else's fault, it just goes to the culture of the government that has given up on transparency and ministerial accountability. And to choose this window to make that announcement tells you everything you need to know.
Is the board a scapegoat, though? We did hear in the report that nurses and doctors were making complaints about what was going on inside that hospital and they weren't being listened to. So there were members of that board that knew what was going on and chose to turn a blind eye. So given that, didn't they deserve to go?
But what accountability will the minister have? This board doesn't look after Caboolture Hospital. It doesn't look after the 44% ambulance ramping across the country, across the state. That's the worst in the country. It doesn't look after the 11 Queenslanders who we spoke about on the weekend who suffered because of help that didn't arrive because of a system poorly planned. So why is it always someone else's fault? What level of responsibility will the minister take? And I think that's a very reasonable question when you see the crises in Queensland Health that is going throughout the system. The frontline have never felt more under pressure, more undervalued. At what point will ministerial accountability kick in? I don't accept that the only failing in Queensland Health relates to one of the health boards.
Would you prefer to see the board stay as is?
I'd prefer to see the minister held accountable. And well, if the minister was accountable, that'd be a great starting point. And
do you think the board should stay or should go?
well, should it not start with a minister being held accountable and then a new? Well, I would welcome a bit of accountability from the person who appoints the board, who oversees it, who funds it. Now, if it is the case that the next Minister for Health, and there should already have been a next Minister for Health, if that person was to make an assessment that there needs to be changes on the boards, well, that will be a role for that minister. But you can't have one health board held accountable for failings in Queensland Health that has been 7.5 years in the making and is raging throughout the entire state. It's a bit rich for the minister to use the sacking of one board on a day when I would question the timing of it, but it's a little bit rich to suggest that one board can be held responsible for the failings of Queensland Health under one minister. I think that's a bit of a cop-out, and that goes to the heart of a government that doesn't value integrity, transparency or accountability.
They're being blamed for the failings at Mackay Base, though.
Understood. The minister's blaming a lot of people. She blamed 50-50, the lack of 50-50 funding before the federal election. That hasn't been the catch cry since the change of government, so somehow the political colour of Canberra is more important than the colour of money for Queensland. She blamed COVID, despite the fact that ambulance ramping had already doubled before we even knew what it was, and it's the worst in the country and everybody's dealing with COVID. They blame the actions of a government that'll be 10 years in the wilderness by the time of the next election. They blame patients for turning up. They blamed a lot of people. They haven't held a lot of accountability. And if you go through the failings in service delivery in this government, it leads you to the question, what exactly does the Premier do to hold her ministers accountable? How often does the Premier sit down with the charter letters and say, on this date I asked you to do this and it hasn't been done? At what point will people who get well paid in this state be held accountable for what they get paid to do? Because it's not happening at the moment, and it's not happening across more than half a dozen portfolios. And it leads to this.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.